So, after some, 6 or 7 years of waiting since Metroid Prime 4 was announced, we finally got a gameplay trailer. And I'm sure most Metroid fans out there are really excited to play this game. And being a huge Metroid fan, I have to say, I'm not really looking forward to it. I played every single Metroid game, except for Pinball and Federation Force. And I'm sure I'll probably get around to Federation Force someday, but I really love this series. Metroid Prime 1 is one of my favorite games of all time. Super Metroid is not far behind. And I also really love Zero Mission and Metroid Prime 2. And I also like plenty of the other games as well. Dread was pretty good, Prime 3 is pretty good, Fusion is pretty good. But specifically in regards to the Prime series, I think having it end as a trilogy was a smart idea, because the ending of Prime 3, you wind up going to the source of the Phazon that's plagued you for 3 games at that point, and you have to beat the entire level without saving, and your health is draining the whole time. It was such a perfect epilogue and a capstone for the series. I don't know why they want to revisit it. They could just do something new. Like, why do you need to make Prime 4? Why can't you just make another 3D Metroid and start a new series? They did that with Other M. Yeah, it wasn't successful, but whatever, you try again. But with Prime 4, I'm not really looking forward to it because I already saw Metroid Prime steadily becoming... I want to say steadily becoming worse, but I don't want that to be interpreted as I think Metroid Prime 2 and 3 are bad games, because they're not. I love both of those games, but I do think that there is a decline in quality going from Metroid Prime 1 to 2 and then to 3. Specifically in regards to the structure, in Metroid Prime 1, you start off on a space frigate, and then Ridley attacks, and you pursue him down to Talon 4, and that's it. That's your setup. It takes like 10 minutes. There's no cutscenes after that outside of introducing new areas and new bosses. Like, it's very little interruption. Yeah, you can scan the environment and read like from computers and read these lore entries so you can get a better understanding of the world. It's not something that's pulling control away from you to show you a cutscene. You're always in control, and the story is unobtrusive. It's there if you want it. It's not really a story, it's more just backstory and history of the world. But that's fine. Metroid doesn't need a story to succeed. In Metroid 1 and in Super Metroid, the story is just an excuse to have this fun space adventure where you're side-scrolling and shooting up aliens. That's all Metroid needs to be. Who determined that it needed to have this rich history for Samus and you need to have all these villains? You don't need any of that. It gets in the way. Metroid is not a story-driven series. It's a gameplay-driven one. We don't need to learn about the history of Samus. In the first game, Samus being revealed to be a girl is just a nice little Easter egg you get when you finish the game under 5 hours. It's just a reward for players that play the game over and over and get better at it. You're like, oh, it's a chick kicking ass the whole time. That's cool. That's all it's supposed to be. You don't need to have this in-depth, well, she's a space marine and she trained under this guy and she's very sensitive and she had to become a battle-hardened warrior. Like, what are you doing? What does this accomplish? Do you think you're making this series better by expanding upon the history of this character? You're making it worse. Just keep Samus as this, like, enigma. This badass that just travels the world and kills aliens. That's it. Why do you pursue building up this character arc in Fusion and in Dread? And I'm sure with Prime 4, like from what we saw in the trailer, we saw some cutscenes, so I'm sure there's going to be even more character development here. And to get back on track, to talk about the Prime series. In Prime 2, there are a lot more cutscenes than the first game because it has a greater emphasis on storytelling. They wanted to develop this universe, probably to set up the third game, but also, you see things like the Space Marines, you have this flashback, you see how they met their end, and then you meet with this Luminoth Elder and he tells you about how there's dark ether and there's this species there that's caused their own species, the Luminoth, to be wiped out, and now you need to go to these different corners of the planet to meet with like these emissaries or whatever they are to talk to them so you can try to find a way to deal with this menace. It's like there's a lot more storytelling and you don't need it. You know, why do you need to have all of these cutscenes? Why do you need to have all of this extra character development for these other characters that don't really matter? Metroid doesn't need this. All you gotta do is say, hey, here's Samus. I'm gonna say, oh, okay, I know what to do. And that's it. You don't need to tell me with like an incentive or a reason. You already had it right with the first game. It was perfect. You didn't need to alter the formula this much. You already had a great idea with introducing the dark and light world and how you have limited ammo this time around. That was good enough. That was your selling point, not the story. And then with Prime 3, they pushed it even further into like this Hollywood blockbuster cinematic direction. And it's my least favorite of the trilogy, but it's still a good game because when you're talking about the gameplay, it's still Metroid. It's still fun to play, but like you start off the game and it plays so much like Halo. You have this cinematic walking around, talking to characters, there's voice acting now, everyone's talking to you. You're like, oh hey, what's going on? You're trying to learn about these Space Marines. Complete waste of time. And the Prime series has been getting progressively more linear. So with the first game, it's classic Metroid. You collect power-ups, you revisit areas constantly the entire game, and the Magmore Caverns serve as like your little fast travel transportation hub. You're constantly entering it to go into the areas. And then with Prime 2, you've got the hub, and you got these 3 little nodes that branch off it, and you stick to those nodes almost the entire time until you complete that area. I think the only time you leave is to get like seeker missiles, but for the most time, once you enter an area, you're confined there until you finish it. They save all the backtracking until the end of the game when you're collecting the Sky Temple keys. And it's not like the first game where if you know where the artifacts are, you can get most of them when you're visiting that area. You have to wait until you get the Dark Visor in Prime 2, which you get like over halfway through the game. And then Prime 3 dispenses with the hub entirely. It's just full-blown linear. Here's a map select screen, pick the next level. So I've seen this series get progressively, like I said, worse with each game. It's more linear, and there's more emphasis on storytelling, and now at this point, it can be considered a trend. So with Prime 4, I am going in with the expectation that it's going to be a more linear game when compared to the older 2D Metroids and when compared to Prime 1, and it's going to have a more cinematic direction, because that's what sells these days. People love cutscenes, people want their games to be movies. That's what this game is probably going to be. I don't want to jump the gun and say that it is going to be this way or that way. I'm not going to say I'm boycotting the game and I'm not going to play it. Like I said, I love this series. I love it dearly. I love so many of these games. I love the entire Prime trilogy. I've played these games so many times I've lost count. But I'd be a fool if I were to ignore these red flags, especially considering Retro hired some chick a few years ago that thinks Samus is trans. And she's a writer, so I can only assume that she's going to have her hand in Metroid Prime 4, and that can only hurt the game as far as I'm concerned, because there shouldn't even be a writer for this series to begin with, let alone someone that has this headcanon that Samus is trans, when the entire reason that she's even a girl to begin with was just this fun little Easter egg. Basically, I don't think Prime 4 really needs to exist. Even from a story perspective, the story was wrapped up nicely. Why do you gotta bring Metroid Prime back? Why do you gotta bring back Dark Samus? Do something new. They did something new with Other M, but because they pursued the story so much, they took it in the wrong direction. You can do a 3D Metroid game and do it well. You already did it right the first time with the first Prime game. Reference that, but you don't need to make a new Prime game, just make something new. Metroid Dread was pretty good. I think the only thing that held it back was it copied too much from Fusion. You have these scenes where you're talking to Adam, except now he's like AI or something. I don't even know. I can't even follow this story because they've convoluted it so much. Why are you doing this? Throw the story away. Throw it in the trash. Spend that time and the money you would have spent hiring these writers and doing all these story drafts and making these cutscenes. Spend that time and budget just making a better base game. That is how you can make a fantastic Metroid game. Don't make it a movie. Don't make it this blockbuster cinematic, like trend-chasing game with wide mass appeal and a lot of marketability. I know developers are out there making products, not really games that they want to make. They want to make the most amount of money possible. And right now the trend is to have games that are high budget with lots of cinematics and flashy cutscenes. Maybe I'm looking into this a little bit too much, judging this much of this game based on like a minute of gameplay footage, but even from what I've seen and from what I've read, it does look like it's going to be continuing that trend of making Metroid Prime a more cinematic series. which is going completely against the grain from what made these games good to begin with from the very beginning. And I don't think Metroid Prime 4 is necessarily being made to appeal to these older Metroid fans. I think it's being made to attract a larger audience, a more modern audience, so they can make more money. If this newer Metroid Prime is great, fantastic. I'd love for it to be great. I'd love for it to be a ton of fun. I'd love to throw it in the rotation whenever I'm in the mood for a Metroid game. I could play Metroid Prime 4. I would love for that. Am I counting on it? Not really. And if it winds up not being good, is that a huge blow? Not really. The older games are still there. I can still replay them. They're still a ton of fun. There are so many Metroid games that if they never make a new one, it's not really that big of a deal. I could just replay the older ones for the next 40 years and I'll be content. I never really wanted a Metroid Prime 4, and I don't think we need a Metroid Prime 4. But since this is what we're getting, I'm gonna just hope that it's good. But if it winds up not being good, hey, no big deal.